Israel let its guard down, which it should not have done. This was a major security and intelligence failure. Israel had been warned in the days leading up to October 7 that the Hamas militants were going to undertake some kind of operation. The Egyptian government gave the warnings, but Israel has the worst government in its history. The government failed completely. In fact, it is reported widely that soldiers that were guarding the border of Gaza and Israel were on holiday or had been shifted to the West Bank. And therefore, Israel let its guard down. And the first thing it should do is keep its guard up. So this is very basic. Second thing that should have happened is that Netanyahu should have stepped down and taken responsibility for this massive failure. The third is to think, what is going to deliver Israeli security? Now, launching a massive war in Gaza, leveling a large part of northern Gaza, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, killing more than 11,000 people and more than 4,500 children. And those are just the identified deaths because it is widely presumed that there are thousands of children and others under the rubble still whose deaths have not been accounted. The idea that this is going to lead to security is mind-boggling. What it has done is to isolate Israel almost entirely in the world. Israel has one backer left. That's the United States. I would say within the United Nations of the 193 countries, you can't count. Certainly, you don't need two hands to count the number of countries that support what Israel's doing. Probably it's on one hand maximum. Israel has isolated itself. It's committing war crimes. Today, it was said that more than 100 UN workers have been killed in this attack. The brazenness of it is also matched by the rhetoric, the intentionality of this extreme right-wing cabinet to level Gaza, to treat the residents of Gaza as animals. That's their line. To say that Gaza will never recover from this. In other words, this brief that was filed about genocide documents the shocking statements, because one of the conditions for a claim of genocide under the Genocide Treaty is intent. And there is such vulgarity in the language of this extremist right-wing government that it's there for all to see the ugliness of it. Now, Israel needs security, but it is never going to achieve security unless there is a political settlement of a conflict that has been going on at least, one could say, for 57 years, since 56 years since the Six-Day War in 1967. And that political settlement requires the political rights of the Palestinian people. And this government not only has launched a war that it cannot win, that could spread to regional war, but it absolutely opposes vehemently, vulgarly, any kind of two-state solution, which almost all the, in fact, I would say the rest of the world, because even on that score, the United States has reiterated almost every day in recent days that that's the only way forward. But this is a government which utterly rejects this. So they're launching a war that they cannot win that will kill tens of thousands of innocents and without any political vision at all other than continued domination by Israel of the Palestinian people, which means no peace at all. So nobody, no friend of Israel should be satisfied for one moment that what's happening is in Israel's interest. There isn't anything that's happening that isn't self-destructive of Israel, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, that Netanyahu is creating destruction of Israel. He's the worst prime minister Israel has ever had. This cabinet is the most extremist that Israel has ever had. And this cabinet is doing grave damage to Israel, starting with letting Israel's basic guard down and then responding in a way which is absolutely destructive of Israel's security and its interests.
I think the event that comes to mind almost immediately, and this is something we've been emphasizing since the very first days after the October 7th attack, when I think the space to kind of criticize Israel was very limited. People were very traumatized by watching those images coming out of Israel. No one wanted to hear any criticism of Israel. So the thing we tried to say early on was, look, we have a historical lesson, a recent historical lesson that's highly comparable, which is we also suffered a terrible terrorist attack on 9/11 22 years ago, and 3,000 civilians were killed on that day. Two gigantic skyscrapers in New York City came crashing down on top of our fellow citizens. A plane was flown into the Pentagon. It was very traumatic. It was very outrageous. And a lot of people have spent the last 20 years talking about the lessons of 9/11, the idea that we overreacted, we fell into bin Laden's hands by doing exactly what he hoped we would do, which was turn the world against us by going around the world madly bombing in a quest for vengeance, but no real geostrategic plan. We said we were going to go to Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban, and 20 years later, we left Afghanistan. The Taliban waltzed right back into power as though nothing had happened, because 20 years of occupation and war radicalized the population even further against the West and in favor of the Taliban. But one of the things that has happened, and what happened back then after 9/11, was anybody who stood up and questioned these wars and what Bush and Cheney were doing with torture and Guantanamo and rendition and that whole panoply of things they wanted to do, everybody got accused who objected of being pro-terrorist or unpatriotic or on the side of al-Qaeda, and it was very effective. It really repressed dissent for a long time in the United States. The tactic that's being used now, not just in Israel but also in the United States, is to say that anyone who isn't fully supportive of the Israeli war is obviously guilty of anti-Semitism, must hate Jews. As a Jew myself, I've heard that, I don't know how many times every day for the last 5 weeks as I've expressed these criticisms of the Israeli response. I'm wondering what you make of that as a tactic, and how do you react to that when you hear that?
Well, let me say the analogy with 9/11 is even more direct. It's said that the United States acted with rage and therefore made a lot of grave errors. But I think it's actually deeper than that. The United States government at the time, I would not say the nation, but I would say the government under George W. Bush Jr. and Cheney, didn't react with rage so much as react with a planned neocon agenda, which was actually already in place in the late 1990s, the Project for a New American Century. And the idea of the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, was in a unipolar world, so they thought in their delusions that the U.S. stands alone in its power and can do whatever it wants and define reality the way that it wants, was literally described by one of the neocon protagonists, was that 9/11 would be used to take out every American foe. And so we know that the first reaction to 9/11 wasn't even al-Qaeda or Afghanistan. The first reaction was Iraq. Now we can go after Iraq. Now we can go after Saddam Hussein. And it was questioned, what do you mean Iraq? Don't you mean Afghanistan? No, no, no. We mean Iraq. Now we can do what we have wanted to do. And so this was an agenda of the United States. It was absolutely mind-boggling in its craziness, in its ineptitude, in the trillions of dollars that it cost, in the destruction of America's reputation around the world, in the free fall of American prestige, which, believe me, happened and continues to happen and has changed the world and diminished America's safety from not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but the not so covert operations to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, the mobilization of NATO to overthrow Gaddafi. This was all a sequence of operations that was anticipated already in the late 1990s. Now, the reason I make all of this analogy is this government of Netanyahu is not just acting with rage, it's acting with an agenda. And you look across the cabinet and listen to the words of Smotrich, the finance minister, of course, to Netanyahu himself, who's just the most awful prime minister in Israel's history, to the interior minister, to across the board. They have an agenda. The agenda has been what is called the Greater Israel, or Greater Land of Israel, which is that Israel really should control in any way not only Israel, but the Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank. And for some, it goes even beyond that, because they look to the book of Joshua in the Bible and say, oh, the promised land is even beyond that. What they're doing
it includes like Jordan and multiple Middle Eastern countries, all part of Greater Israel.
It actually goes to Mesopotamia, it goes to the Euphrates, right. no less. So it's a kind of mind-boggling book, by the way, to read, because it's a book of serial genocides, as a matter of fact. But the point is that this cabinet wants to clear out Gaza. That was the first impulse. Actually, the United States was almost pulled along. They tried to talk El-Sisi in Egypt into this. He said, no way I'm going to be a party to the next Nakba, the next disaster of the Palestinian people by opening Rafah, the border with Gaza and Egypt, to take in hundreds of thousands of Gazans fleeing after Israel told them, you must flee for your life, giving them a few hours to flee for their life. So this is an agenda. And in that sense, the analogy to 9/11 is even more precise. It's not just blind rage. It's a political agenda. And we should understand, I think it's the smartest words about war that have been uttered since Sun Tzu, since the strategy of war in ancient China, by von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany in the period just after the Napoleonic Wars. And in von Clausewitz's famous book on war, he says very famously that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And so when you see conflict, think politics. Don't just think rage or attack and counterattack, but what's the underlying politics? In Ukraine, the underlying politics is NATO enlargement. This is a war over NATO enlargement, which I think was a reckless thing for the United States to do, and it put Ukraine into the battleground of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, which is destroying Ukraine. Now, what is the politics here? The politics here is that the people of Palestine do not have political rights. They live in a condition dominated by Israel, effectively, as countless organizations have rightly pointed out, an apartheid system imposed by Israel. And the whole world, including the United States, has said this has to be remedied by a Palestinian state. And even President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken have repeated this several times in the last days. But this is precisely what Netanyahu and his government oppose. So this is not a war to end the Hamas threat in order to move to a state of Palestine. Completely the opposite. This is a war being waged by Israel ostensibly to crush Hamas, but to dominate